I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. My name's Gareth Ford-Williams. Last time I was here, I was still head of accessibility at the BBC. I've been there for, it was 17, actually it was probably closer to 18, but not quite years. I'd set up the accessibility team back in 2005 and the design research team in 2010. I won't do my full bio, but I've left the BBC now. I'm one of the directors at ably.com. It's spelled ab11y.com. I've also got ADHD and I'm dyslexic. Now, the point about my ADHD is that means that I regularly forget things. So these slides are here to keep me on track as much as they are to convey information. So if I do lose a little bit of that track, I do apologise. So just to give a name check, so the other directors at Ably are Michael Matthews, Ian Pouncey, Charlie Turrell, and Michael Southgate. I'm going to do a quick description of myself. So I'm a typical 50-something, 52-year-old white male, follically challenged, wears glasses. And and I can tell from this year's AXCON t-shirt being a bit snugger than last year's AXCON t-shirt, I obviously had a very good Christmas. So this is one of this talk. It is a work in progress. It's only the second time I've given it, and it's changed considerably since the first. So it's a little bit of an adventure. And I'll first tell you a little bit about what it's not. So this is, I'm going to make a definition. This is not about what I like to call legal experience design. This is not about WCAG and the law or compliance or anything along those lines. This is about what I like to call human experience design. And it's purely about people and the way things impact on people. That's the thing that kind of drives me and interests me the most, not necessarily compliance. Compliance full of sensible stuff, but that's not it. Accessibility sort of became a legal problem because the failure of the design industry to be inclusive. And this is why I want to focus on the outcomes that are human-centric, because of design choices that might or might not be about compliance. So this is about the impact on humans and not about risk. Accessibility benefits everyone. I think we've heard this phrase so many times during this conference and in so many other conferences, and it's a phrase that I have always truly believed. But the problem is, we understand that and we believe that this increases audience reach, engagement opportunity, it improves customer satisfaction for everyone. It's about meeting expectations and delivering comparative experiences. But one of the biggest problems I've always had, I mean, running, accessibility across an organization, on a digital estate, the size of the BBC's, which is enormous. It's 44 languages, millions of web pages, and millions of users. I think the audience is somewhere like 750 million internationally, and it's the same size as Facebook in the UK. It's massive. It's incredibly challenging, and there was always this whole thing that we could get a lot of data that would enable us to make decisions about, sort of the way that we approach things, but then evaluating what we did is incredibly hard. Does WCAG cover everyone's needs? Is WCAG an answer to this? Now, despite it being very useful and full of sensible stuff, there's a lot it doesn't cover because WCAG is a work in progress. And it's not it was never designed to give user outcome insights, but about insight into inclusive engineering and design practice. So it's something that you use to help create something. It's not really very good at evaluating things for people. It's part of that, but it's not where the answer lies. So WCAG compliance is not UX data. This is why, we need UX designers, we need design researchers, we need developers to turn guidelines into things that we need or love. Evaluating how inclusive a website is using WCAG alone is like evaluating how delicious or satisfying a meal was from the chef's ingredient shopping list and their written recipe. Websites like meals need to be experienced to be evaluated, and different people will have different and equally valid feedback about that experience. There's a lot of people who've actually already talked about this in this conference, a lot more eloquently than I will. And actually, someone who touched on this really, really well was Shell Littles in her session, which I found massively insightful. And she talked about a lot of the sort of common sense and user-driven approaches around design, around components. And so I won't go into that in any detail, but please do check her out. It was a brilliant session. So kind of for my kind of example in this is, you know, if we were talking about user experience, because imagine we have a WCAG compliant enterprise system in the organization that you have, it's about booking a taxi, and you know, and this is something Jamie Knight talked about before, is, you know, how long should it take to book a taxi would be a really good question. You know, and if you had a team that was very, very diverse, or you took you know, a group of people within that organization, you have a wheelchair user, someone who's vision impaired and uses a cane, someone who's short stature, someone who has upper body limb difference, a couple of people who come across as probably quite standard issue. Can we accurately determine their needs? You know, do we know if anyone has a hidden condition? Probably not. Remember what Jamie Knight, and please check his session out, said about assumptions. We can make assumptions about this group, but we don't know anything about attained literacy, technology expertise, coping strategies, preferences, stress. We can jump to conclusions in kind of demographically breaking down what we think is capability. And so, you know, based on those kind of assumptions that we sometimes have, how long could that take? And it could be anything. Imagine if it took anything from 4 minutes to 20 minutes to book the same taxi, to do the same journey. And the difference in times could be to all different things. We find out someone whose English was a second language, and they were trying to use an English language based system. You know, they may have had, you know, may have found it cognitively incredibly difficult to navigate. They may have struggled with impact technology, and all these different things compound. And so the difference between, you know, 4 minutes booking a taxi and 20 minutes booking the same taxi is not comparable, even if things were technically accessible. And then you would start asking things about all the systems, the 20 plus systems they use every day. They may use them more. You know, do they? And you know, I would ask questions, because one of the teams that I managed even for a short while was the internal assistive technology and team, which also evaluated internal systems at the BBC. Is, you know, if this fails people in this way, you know, a compliance system, what do we expect? Do we expect these people to take shorter or fewer breaks? Should they work longer hours? Should they be less productive? And when you ask people in management, they go, no, we've none of those things. The problem is, if people are impeded by design and not by compliance, this is the reality of what happens, and people basically get designed out of their jobs. And so what we did is we used task analysis, we used good UX, and tried to find good UX data to try and understand this, and particularly when we were doing things like procurement. Because if you hire, as a BBC does, hire more disabled people, and the design of your internal systems disables them, then everyone loses, the organization loses as well. So when you're talking about some of these things, and we're dealing with these kind of, you know, sort of breaking down audiences, you know, the question who comes up is quite a lot. Who are we talking about? You know, who are the demographics we should be concerned with? And there is that word, is demographics. It's an interesting one around disability statistics, and again, there have been some fantastic sessions already touching on this right the way through. And Kevin Molinero, he was talking a lot about this earlier, and Samuel Prue and Rebecca Tops, and you know, and it, you know, I won't duplicate what they said, but if you start looking out there, the numbers, the statistics vary depending on a lot of different things, particularly about how inclusive the methodology was used, or even how the word disability is defined. And you can find anything between 15 and 30% being reported by different organizations. And if you start cross-referencing that and averaging it out, and this is from numbers from the UK, US, EU, Canadian governments and other governments, World Health Organizations and various charities, it becomes quite interesting when you start seeing the numbers coming out. So, you know, the you know, culturally deaf and profoundly deaf is somewhere around a little bit under 0.5%. People who are registered blind, even when you take the RNIB's numbers and they say, well, double them, because lots of people do not register under that, you're probably looking at just under to around about 1%. Severely vision impaired, about 4%. So you've got a big 5% there. autistic spectrum condition and severe learning disabilities, numbers are really hard to separate, and you find methodologies cross over and definitions cross over, but it's somewhere in the 5%. Same with upper body motor, because that's particularly impactful within, so contextual within accessing digital services. You're talking around the 8%. Severely hearing impaired, where it impacts access to content, you're talking over 12% of people. And then you're talking about, then there's the group that no one seems to include, which are people like me. I would never appear in disability statistics, even though I have 2 hidden conditions. ADHD and dyslexia regularly don't get counted, along with quite a few other hidden conditions. And so you're probably looking 15% plus. So even with the crossover between these groups, you could be anywhere in 30 to 35%. But then it falls apart again, because not everyone identifies as disabled. Some people do not recognize that they even have a disability, or do not want to declare they have a disability when asked. And so there's a certain amount of play within these numbers. It becomes quite difficult to use demographics. And everyone's needs are equally important. And if they're not designed for, then they will be excluded. So something around those numbers you have to take on is demographics are medical, conditions differ. There's an enormous amount of sort of intersectionality between need within groups, and there's experience, there's even privilege to deal with, whether people have money and can access things that can help enable them. And so the thing that around demographics is that they don't represent lived experiences. And lived experiences are the things that are the most interesting from a designer's point of view, because they're the things that help you understand people, rather than a label that you can give someone. Jamie and Lion, I love to quote them, Jamie was on earlier, and he said one thing to me, and I think this was quite early on when we first met, about 7 or 8 years ago. And he said, if you've met one autistic person, congratulations, you've met one autistic person. And this is a very, very profound statement when it comes down to it, because Kevin was talking about this earlier as well, is there's this kind of danger that you meet one person, you understand their needs, and then you try and extrapolate an entire community from one person's perspective, and it just simply doesn't work. So then you get into kind of beyond, sort of where that data, and thinking more about lived experiences rather than demographics. Then you start thinking about the types of methodologies that we use, or we use qualitative research because it's incredibly useful for exploration. And Christine Hemphill, I know, has just delivered a session on that, and so did Rebecca Tops. And it is incredibly powerful. It gives insight, it gives ideas, it helps stimulate the design process and the exploration process. And as Kevin pointed out, sort of, and Jamie, that data is not the plural of anecdote. But a lot of this information can be quite anecdotal, but it is very, very, very useful. And it brings sort of a real context into the process. But quantitative is incredibly useful for evaluation. So if qualitative helps us understand people, and it helps us design, and it helps us explore, then evaluation needs to come back from the entire audience, where you understand where it impacted. And you can't use qual for evaluation purposes in that way, because you can't extrapolate an entire audience from very few people. There's always that kind of danger, with the iPlayer, with an audience in the UK of about 19 million a week. It's, you can't take 20 or 30 people's perspectives and extrapolate 19 people from that. It just doesn't work. So qualitative research gives you the time to do due diligence, to ask questions as part of the UX design process, because the numbers of participants is always relatively small, and you get quality time to spend with those participants. Demographics are relevant to qual in that way, because they are part of that insight. Because as well, within qual, you're dealing with ethnographics, we're dealing with culture, we're dealing with a lot of other things which are very, very important. And nothing about us without us is incredibly important within that process. It's a great phrase, that, and I absolutely love it. And it is practical within this context. People are experts in their own lived experiences. But qualitative research can't, as I said, can't help evaluate a design, because you can never get statistically significant sample for each disability group. I mean, even just going back to that one sort of crude list I had earlier, you know, even if you turn around and said, well, we need minimum 100 people within each of those groups, and within each of those groups there's sort of subgroups as well of condition and experience, and so you're suddenly starting talking very, very large numbers. And my background originally was in marketing, and we used to say, you know, 100 is probably enough for us to have a fair amount of degree. We usually would look for, you know, 300 opinions coming back, and that's for each segment. You know, I want, if it was people like me, if they were looking for 52-year-old white males, you know, we would ask 300 52-year-old white males, and then it irons out the kind of the blips within this. You understand what it is across the group, and you can remove the bits that kind of create problems within those statistics. So quantitative research can and should be used for evaluation, and it's one of those things that we kind of realized this a long time ago. But the problem, you know, and it should also include things like satisfaction. It takes us, you know, we should go into, if we could even use, you know, quantitative, you can even go into sort of task analysis for deeper exploration and ask people to do things and give us feedback on them. But there are some big traps within it, and it's probably why a lot of organizations kind of probably avoid this. You know, because they use, you know, using the use of demographics is problematic, and I've kind of already said this, but also when you're starting to go down using medical segmentation, and it becomes medical data, and medical data is incredibly problematic to gather, to manage in a way, and you know, and avoidance becomes one of those things. Is probably the best way of handling it is by not gathering it, and you're drifting into ethical issues as well as legal issues. So the thing is, with a while ago, I started asking question within myself, is whether the social model of disability is actually a better solution of an approach than the medical model of disability when it comes to segmentation in quantitative research. So, you know, demographics obviously arguably being medical because they focus on the condition, whereas the social model is more about the people's needs and the barriers that people experience. Kevin and Jamie have already given fabulous explanations about this, and I will give a very short one for anyone who hasn't seen their sessions yet. But the basis of the social model, if you're not familiar with it, is impairment plus environment equals a disability. So the person isn't disabled until someone, no one is disabled until someone designs something that does not consider their needs. You know, when a design is, you know, sort of it's just an idea. We all have equal access to something because it is an abstract. But the further on we get into the design process, and the more decisions are made, the more we're risk of filtering people out if we do not consider, you know, the breadth of needs of user needs. And people are complex. Dieter Rams put this beautifully many years ago. Wonderful product designer, and you know, the huge influence on organizations like Apple. But where he said, you know, indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is actually the one and only cardinal sin in design. And our needs are a major part of all of our realities. You know, the part that determines whether we can access or something or not is based on whether our needs are met. And accessibility in that context requires designed experience based on meeting human needs. And so inaccessibility, if you think about it, is actually a proactive exercise if needs are not met within a design process. And this is why I get onto this whole thing about it being human experience design is what we need to consider. but are needs easy to identify? Now, if you were here and came to the session that I was part of last year, AXCON 2021, we talked a little bit about this, and I'm going to say where we started this process. So the readability session last year was myself, David Bailey, who's on the left of this picture, myself in the middle, Bruno Marg, who's on the right. David Bailey, very famous typographer and visual designer from who's, you know, and Bruno Marg, incredibly famous type designer, and the fourth enigmatic member of the group, Michael Matthews. We did a session called Don't Believe the Type, which was all about font accessibility. But the thing is, when we were starting to think about font accessibility and we wanted to sort of open up and unpack the question, we didn't say, is one font more accessible than another? We wanted to know whether features impacted on the accessibility of a font, and those collection of features within a font, whether that makes those more accessible or less accessible. What can we learn? You know, like websites, fonts are comprised of many features. I think we identified about 80 that we tracked, and font features and letter combinations we would tracked across 20 different typefaces. But we also came up with this kind of question when we were developing the methodology, was what was an acceptable degree of inaccuracy. And quant surveys are only as inclusive as, first off, as the quant platform they ran on. So we ended up we looked at all of them at the time, and all of the off-the-shelf quant platforms at the time, and all of them had accessibility issues. So we knew at some point we were going to filter people out, and so we ended up having to build a bespoke test platform. But there was also, you know, self-selection and demographics muddy the water, because we wanted to know about lived experiences and impact. But we also wanted to know, you know, we also wanted to know things, you know, where you know, sort of the emotional side of stuff as well. And so we were kind of quite considerate in our approach to this, and went down this idea of, you know, evaluating and went, you know, as part of the need, we didn't ask people about their conditions. What we did is, as part of the test, we actually did an evaluation of their needs, and we're able to create groups. We were able to create groups around needs, around vision impairment. And we were able to create a group around phonological dyslexia. All dyslexia is phonological, but you know, there are things that drift in that aren't dyslexia. Anyway, another presentation. We wanted to know about mainstream readers, and we wanted to know about people who struggled with certain types of contrast processing. Now, we didn't ask people this, but we gave them you know, a survey, and we asked lots of different questions, and we detected various different things, and we collected a lot of data about the people as they were doing the survey, and we used algorithms to be able to determine the probability of the needs of the people that were the participants. Now, we had, by the time we did the presentation, it was over 2,000 user sessions were run with individuals, which was, you know, over 300,000 data points collected, and we were collecting information about platform user characteristics, font features, letter combinations. But when we were looking at the user characteristics, we were evaluating whether we were absolutely certain that for something around, you know, sort of vision, they were not experiencing a barrier, or we were absolutely certain. Anything that was in between moderate to mild, we had these other groups that we put together. We, for the purposes of the study, discounted the data because we were not as confident in the analysis as we were with the other two. But then it gave us a really good comparison between the two groups. So we collected all this data, and it also meant, by being absolutely certain about the people we were talking about, that we had a very high degree of accuracy in determining when we were identifying barriers. And so we moved this whole thing from demographics to needs and preferences. And we changed the entire segmentation model by moving this way. And this way we were able to focus on issues that were shared by larger audience segments. So someone, you know, asks how many people does something affect, the numbers you can give are, I believe, are a lot healthier. And I'll explain around this. So moving this on to thinking about websites, mobile applications, games, enterprise systems, etc., and moving away from demographics to needs, you can look at things like language accessibility as a need. So the need for clear and concise and simple and straightforward and understandable and comprehensible language and use of language. You know, from a demographic point of view, people would talk about people with dyslexia, people with learning disabilities, people with low literacy, people with age-related condition, people who are experiencing this as a second language. But all of them have that same need around clear and simple language. And so if you bring all of those groups together and others, it creates something that's a lot more powerful within segmentation. And so instead of being about 1.6% for second language or 16.5% by these are the UK government's numbers for lower literacy, or dyslexia around 10%, or cognitive and learning around 5%, you can say actually this group is roughly a third of our audience. It's somewhere between 33 and 35% if you include the other groups as well. And suddenly this becomes a much more powerful requirement around this. And so exploring needs further, you can then start looking at things like, preferences around closed caption. And there is a need for closed caption within certain groups and closed captions. And again, second language, cognitive and learning, hearing impairment, culturally deaf or profoundly deaf, cognitive and learning groups and more. You're looking somewhere around the 26% of people who can benefit from closed captions. But when you then look at the actual data and you start adding mainstream need within those and you start thinking about need in its greatest context, and Jamie and others have talked today about environmental and situational need, and you look at the numbers that come from organizations like Netflix, Twitter and Facebook, that over 80% of the audience consuming video either silenced or with captions, and silence, this is with captions burnt in or with closed captions, it becomes mainstream behavior from what seems to be like something that is an add-on for access needs becomes a mainstream need because 80% plus of the audience, why wouldn't you caption with knowing that? And this, so it becomes sort of the needs or preference group becomes that thing. So we've been working a lot. We've spent most of the last year really focusing on understanding how we can collect data and how we can sort of pull in as many different data points that we can, and how we can then turn these and into something that's really meaningful and insightful about a person. And so this could be everything from data that's given to us or offered to us, data that we collect in an ethical way, information about the way that they interact with a study, and so we built this framework, and we also then said, well, we also need to then add sort of UX study on top of segmentation study, and if you add satisfaction to all of this, it becomes incredibly powerful. And you can then start your task analysis, and you can then start evaluating how inclusive a particular service or experience or user journey is. Where we've got to at the moment is we start, looking at preferred modalities, UX needs groups, preferences, neurodivergent intersections, and standard behavior. I don't really have time to go into all of these. There's, if you want to come and talk to me about them, that's great. But, taking things like, a preference group being, sort of closed captions, or a UX need group being language accessibility. But we're starting to add more and more, the richer the data that you start understanding about people and you start thinking about needs particularly, you start getting real sense around, sort of how large these these groups are and how impactful this could be. And again, focusing on the definite no's and the definite strongs within, against each of those needs groups. And so in a kind of recent study, we've been, we've been doing some testing. It's one of those things that you realize, when you start thinking about human need and the intersectionality of human need, and when you start understanding that needs are so broad, you start realizing that actually needs groups are hidden in plain sight. We all have needs. And so testing and understanding that we have a degree of certainty of evaluating those needs you can find, you can do segmentation. By the way, this is not, these numbers, there's a graph up on the screen, and it's what is actually sort of percentages within a study. These are not percentages about how many people they have need. They're a degree of within that group, how many people are we confident had that need. And so we started looking at proportionality, and can we find enough people with that need? There may be a load more, but we have to be certain of that person's need to be able to take that data and to be able to find 100 of them within a study group or 300 of them within a study group. It may impact more, but you always have to be, we have to be absolutely certain that we're identifying the right people. And then sort of we've taken this beyond that, and we started combining different types of data, understanding, sort of bringing in data around user feedback, platform needs and preferences, contextualizing it into types of service, and thinking about navigation, comprehension, function, task completion, task time, user choice, and satisfaction, and contextual, questioning, because we do different things on different sites, and this is incredibly important stuff. And so so we've spent our time building sort of tools that will help us understand if a product has an issue, and within the context of needs, where that issue is. Something as a slight sideline here, I've always wondered whatever happened to enjoyable in when we talk about user. I've absolutely forgotten the word. This is ADHD and dyslexia for you in action. Principles. So we talk about perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But really, when it comes down to it, I think they were written in a time when most of the internet the internet that we were concerned with government websites, sort of online banking and transactional sites, and maybe academic sites and learning. But we now are in a world with games and video streaming services and social media and live events and interest sites and collaborative platforms and entertainment sites. And if these things aren't enjoyable, then it doesn't matter if they're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. People ain't going to come back, and they need to be enjoyable by people who have access needs. So the other thing that we've been focusing on is around that whole thing around data security, and it's something that we thought a lot about when we did the readability study. Needs and conditions are intersectional, and if you start focusing on that, it's not about medical, and it becomes much more difficult to actually determine anything that is about medical data events need, because again, language accessibility, if you come across someone that is struggling with a certain thing around accessing because of language, it doesn't mean that they're dyslexic. It might mean that English is their second language, and so you can't start jumping to those kind of conclusions around it. We made sure that within readability study that we anonymize the data. We made sure that we present reporting that is aggregated, but you can then do a lot more. I mean, this is why we have within the team Michael Southgate, who used to be the director of compliance at Google. It's always good in these kind of situations to have a lawyer in your team, but it's also to know that if there's an organization who's running a study on the site, the site doesn't collect the data, the people running the study collects the data, but then the site identity is unknown to the data collector, which means the two worlds, the data and the users, cannot be connected up. And it also, other things that we've been exploring around small data samples are not reported. If you're collecting data from 20 people, it can be quite easy to be able to reverse engineer, particularly if it was within enterprise systems and within a smaller user group, like the employees of an organization. So you always want to make sure that you're collecting a large group, and you're not saying exactly when you collected it, because you might know where they are. There are other pieces of data that can be added. So we've been spending a lot of time to make sure that what we're doing is both legal and ethical. So kind of gathering all of this data and thinking about sort of everything from segmentation from intersectional needs through to bringing in satisfaction data around UX experience and understanding platform. What can all of this give us, and what are the opportunities that can be afforded by understanding sort of inclusive design data in this way? and that can be used for a sort of evaluation. The thing is that user experience design for me is always, I always think of it as a haystack. Finding all the candidate user outcome needles is always the challenge, to understand what it is that you need to be doing. Every path and variant in user setup and behavior means finding inclusive UX issues becomes ever so more problematic. And when you then start extrapolating that into a large product or an estate, it really can be like finding needles in a haystack. And when you're using kind of going directly into try and understand those and try and find those issues by using auditing, for instance, or by using qualitative research, it can be incredibly problematic because you can't do those things at scale. You pick a sample and hope you hit something. You need things like quantitative user data that will enable you to target where within that haystack you should look for the needles. And there's the added problem is that we're dealing with agile processes. We're in sort of test, evaluate, improve, deliver, and we're in these cycles. And and different types of research sits within those. Within test, we would probably do the twant research. We would evaluate that. We would probably move and understand further with qual or with auditing to understand, and involve that within improve, or it could be, and we then move into deliver. And accessibility auditing and qual research, can struggle to integrate into agile because it's trying to deal with breadth. But if we can use quant in and in quant inclusive data, every time the code changes or every time a new feature is added, evaluating that on against user outcome, it can enable us to identify where we can then use these other methods to actually pinpoint what it is that we need to do to change, to improve. We think that things like this kind of tools that we've been building will enable sort of data that can be used within multivariate testing to show the impact of different design decisions on different needs groups within your A/B testing. It can help target resources by continuous monitoring using sort of inclusive quantitative data as part of the release cycle. The data can show if an issue has arisen on what product, for which group of users, and even what the nature of the barrier in terms of the user experience is. And this means usability and accessibility testing can be focused where they need most. It's a change management thing as well. Running studies across an estate on a regular basis as part of the release cycle can identify on individual, where there are issues on individual products recurring. So it is possible to provide evidence to identify which teams are most in need of support and training. This kind of data can help with inclusive employment. Using this type of data and study on internal systems, you can quickly identify which systems undermine your efforts to be an inclusive employer. And this can help increase productivity in an ethical way. It can also, and this is the thing that I was always struggled with, it can actually show that what you're doing from an accessibility program is how it is, when tracked over time, what the impact of accessibility or inclusive design programs can be done when, sort of based on customer or employee outcomes. This gets back to that statement of accessibility benefits everyone. And without this kind of data, how can we prove that? So what's next is that we've spent a year or over a year sort of building the initial tools around exploring this. We started with websites. We're going to do stuff around enterprise systems. We're going to think about mobile applications. We've already been thinking about that in games. And we want to start talking to organizations. Contact us by, if we have a contact address, which is mail@ab11y.com. But we want to explore with partners how rich, inclusive UX data can improve the effectiveness and accessibility of an inclusive design program or an accessibility program. We can help evaluate the impact of both technical and design improvements based on user outcomes. Thank you so much. I'm not quite sure if I've overrun or underrun, but thank you so much for sticking with me with that. My name is Gareth Ford Williams. Illustrations, by the way, from Noun Project and Hasbro. Thank you very much. And you can find me on Twitter at gareth.com. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gareth, for a great presentation. And we still have around 8 minutes left. So we have time for a few questions, and we've got lots of them. So let me dive right into the questions. All right. So first, and for folks, if you have more questions, please go ahead and submit them. And also feel free to vote on the existing questions. So first one I have here is, how would you define the point where an annoyance becomes a barrier?
Oh, I would not define that. I'd let the users define that. You know, if you ask 1,000 users around something and, you know, 500 of them come back and say, this really pisses me off and I can't do what I want to do, I take their word for it. You know, I think you have to make that call based on user data. You know, your users know what it is that they're expecting from your, you know, they want to be able to do their banking and they want to come out of it not feeling like they need to get a glass of whiskey, you know, for making a transaction. They need to feel like, you know, that they've had fun, where, you know, where fun is appropriate. Can banking be fun? I don't know. Yeah, let's ask our users. But, you know, user data is the only time where you can actually define that. And if if users are coming back and telling you that something is not meeting their expectations, then you have to take that it is not meeting their expectations. But you would want to know some specifics. You know, you want to know what their needs are. You know, you want to find a large group of those people's needs, and you want to know whether it is to do with the navigation of the site, whether it is to do with the content consumption, because then that helps you explore it, helps you recreate the problem, it helps you dive into that. So, you know, always listen to your users. You know, it's not for me to tell anyone what their experience is.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right. So folks are also curious about where can they access the references, all the great stats that you had. Where can they find that information and access the references?
Which references necessarily? I mean, contact me. Tweet me at Gareth FW on Twitter, and I will try and reference something out. So I spend a lot of time things like the demographics. I mean, that was just me. It's just pulling in as much demographics as I could and looking for the mean average. But there's all sorts of issues with demographics. You know, things like the World Health Organization just allowed every country to pretty much define disability in however they wanted to do it and use their own methodology for collecting data. And so, you know, you hope that it averages out across the countries, but, you know, everyone seems to have a slightly different idea around things. And also you've got, you know, this whole issue that there's an enormous amount of privilege within, you know, what a barrier is. So people in South Sudan may not have the same access, you know, to people in Canada to the same type of assistive technology. And, you know, and you're dealing with cultural differences, you're dealing with socioeconomic differences. Crystal Preston Watson talks about the socioeconomic challenges around accessibility, and that's something that, you know, you should be very mindful if you have an international audience. You know, it's fine talking about people from Europe and North America and what assistive technologies they use, but you can't extrapolate those experiences for the rest of the world from that.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for a couple of more questions. How do you account for the fact that some of these segments overlap, i.e. people with multiple conditions?
I think, you know, sort of, this is the problem with demographics. Demographics overlap all over the place based on their needs. And I think that is the thing is if you think about the needs, when you talk to a designer and you talked about a demographic, the first thing they want to know is what are their needs? And I actually think, let's cut to the chase and just talk about needs as a group. So it doesn't matter if I'm dyslexic and someone else is autistic and someone else has a lower level of literacy because of their educational upbringing, or someone else. If we all have the same need, then it's all relevant. We're all in the same group in that context. You know, I think Jamie's talked about this really, really beautifully and much more eloquently than I do, that, you know, identity is a really important part around disability. And, you know, there is culture and there is law and there are other lenses around this, and they're very, very, very important to think about in terms of this. But when it comes into need, It's just need, and we should bring those things together, because, then you're dealing, you've also got a much more powerful story to talk about in your organization. If we sort out our labeling conventions, if we make this much easier to understand, here is a bigger group because of that intersectionality of need. And I don't think it's a problem. I think it's an opportunity.
True. That's true. Right. Next question is, how do you balance the human side with the technology side when it comes to evaluating technology?
Oh, they two live together. You can't separate the two. If you just purely think about accessibility from a technical and functional point of view, and you don't think about things from, a design or an emotional point of view, then you're only ever dealing with part of the picture, part of the problem. And you can't separate. I think standards and guidelines are incredibly useful. They're a wonderful foundation for, building things. And it's the brilliant people out there, but people build on top of this, and people bring in techniques, they bring in methodologies, they bring in user insight, and it is that whole thing of making the meal. It is the process of cooking it. It's all of that thing around timing and temperatures and technique and presentation, and that makes it. It's not just about the ingredients and a list and a method. It's so much more. And I think you can't separate the two things out. Accessibility is not just about function. It's about emotion, and it's about as much about, technical as it is design. You can't separate these out, because then you get things that people want to use and keep coming back using. They have a good feeling about it. Doesn't mean that they love it, but it might mean that they're just not stressed out about it. I mean, there's nothing I hate more than an online form. It doesn't matter even how accessible the form is. They stress me out, no wonder. And if someone has taken the time to take that into consideration, because I find them really difficult to process. And go back to Shell Little's thing about forms. I knew it was a brilliant session. I loved some of the things she said. And I wished, and I want to come out of it thinking, I want to go back to that organization and not be terrified of that form again. Feel like that's good. So you can't separate the two. You can't.
Thank you. All right. I think we can probably squeeze one last question in. The question is, how do assistive technologies help those with cognitive disabilities? And specifically curious about assistive technology with dyslexia, with reading numbers.
Wow. Yeah, let's do a whole presentation on that one. Again, I'm one dyslexic person who happens to have ADHD, and many other things. I would only give you my opinion, but I much prefer listening to books than reading books. Long form reading experiences have to be heard. For me, I really struggle with that. I love, but good text to speech engines within that. I find that the combinations of both hearing and reading text within captions work incredibly well for me in comprehension. So I know what is going on and I can stand it, and I think that might be more of an ADHD. I don't know. But for me, that sits very, very well, and I won't necessarily associate that with either condition. And I find then short form or navigation or whatever, sometimes it's a mixture of both. It depends on the design. And it depends on a lot of things, how readable and legible the font is. And sometimes I just want to be able to query something and have it read to me. I misread so much of the world. I read everything twice because, it's for me, old MacDonald had a farm, OIEIA. There's things that I sit there and go, there's something wrong about that. And I really struggle with and I have to go back and know it was EIEIO. For some reason my brain muddles things up and it plays. And some people with dyscalculia have that same thing with numbers, and we use our different technologies. So I would never assume that a specific technology is necessarily about a specific condition. People use stuff and what's available for them, and they find their own strategies based on what they've been taught. Jamie taught me a wonderful one a few years ago, which I absolutely loved. And he taught me to use Zoom on my Mac. He taught me to use the magnifier, not because I don't need bigger text. I just need less text. And he just said, look at this, how to reduce cognitive load using Zoom. And I was like, It was like a revelation. And it was wonderful, and removed all this lovely noise, and I could focus, and I found it suddenly became more accessible to me. So, you know, go and ask 300 dyslexic people what they deal with, and then come back, or at least 3, you know, or you'll get your answer that way.
Yes, cool, awesome. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session. So thank you so much, Gareth. It was a great session. We still have lots of questions, unfortunately, but we ran out of time. So if you have any questions, feel free to directly reach out to Gareth. And thank you everyone for attending. And just a friendly reminder that you can always come back to the same session page and watch the recording at any time. And enjoy the rest of AXCOM. Thank you, everyone. All right, take care.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Goodbye.